संस्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय Ramakrishnaaya te namaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's class. It should be a fun one, a bit outside the box, even for Vedantins. Psychoanalysis meets Vedanta, the debate between Romain, Rolland and Sigmund Freud. They actually had a debate. Most people don't even know about it. But many followers of our tradition, devotees, monks in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, they've heard of Romain Rolland. Why? Anyone know? Because Rolland wrote biographies on Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, which many of us have read. I've read both of them. Many monks have read them. The biography of Sri Ramakrishna is called Life of Sri Ramakrishna, published in 1929. He also wrote a Life of Swami Vivekananda, also discusses Swamiji's teachings in the 4 yogas. That was published just 1 year later. Romain Rolland was a very famous French writer, thinker, intellectual, especially novelist. And he, in fact, won the Nobel Prize in 1915 for his novel Jean Christophe, which is considered a classic in French literature. So he's a great intellectual of his time. And he was also friends with Sigmund Freud. And this is much less well known. And between 1923 and 1936, they exchanged many, many letters. Rolland would write in French. Freud would write in German usually. Sometimes in French. They knew both languages. Now, this debate is really fascinating because it's a debate about religion and spiritual experience. And you can imagine the different standpoints because Rolland, as an admirer of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, he strongly believed in the basic principles of Vedanta philosophy. And Freud was the founder of what? Psychoanalysis. Very different from Vedanta. At least Freudian psychoanalysis. And so they're coming from completely different and arguably opposing standpoints. And they're trying desperately to find common ground because they both admire each other as human beings. And yet intellectually and spiritually and temperamentally, they're just so different. So it's a really fascinating exchange. And I want to talk about this debate that they had about mystical experience. What I'm going to discuss in today's class is based on an article I wrote, which is published in this volume, the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta, edited by Ayan Maharaj. Who is this Ayan Maharaj? That was the name I published under before I got sannyasa. And there's a chapter in here which is called, hold on, Debating Freud on the Oceanic Feeling, Romain Rolland's Vedantic Critique of Psychoanalysis, and his call for a, quote, new science of the mind. So it's an academic article, and if you're interested, I've provided a link under the YouTube description for those of you who want to go deeper, because I'm not going to discuss everything that's in the article. I'm just highlighting some of the main points that come out of this really fascinating and still instructive, I think, debate between this Vedantin Romain Rolland and the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. So let's go back to 1927. This is the year when Freud sends Rolland a copy of a book that he has just published and which he's very proud of, called The Future of an Illusion. Die Zukunft einer Illusion. And what's the illusion? The illusion is that religion is true. And the whole book is a kind of polemical attack on religion, saying that religion is infantile and that it shows a lack of maturity and a certain kind of gullibility and lack of rationality. And Rolland, so the overall take of Freud's in Future of an Illusion is that religion is a regression to an infantile state, basically. Now, in a December 5th, 1927 letter to Freud, Rolland reads this book of Freud's, is not particularly impressed, but they're both very polite. These are polite Europeans in the early 20th century. So they don't like directly kind of attack each other or argue with each other, but it's just the fireworks are just beneath the surface. That's part of what makes the reading so interesting. So let me read you Rolland's response to Freud's attack on religion in Future of an Illusion. Rolland says the following: "Your analysis of religions is a just one, but I would have liked to see you doing an analysis of spontaneous religious sentiment, sentiment religieux spontané, or more exactly of religious feeling, sensation religieuse, which is wholly different from religions in the strict sense of the word and much more durable." Then he goes on. He makes it even clearer what he means. "What I mean is totally independent of all dogma, all credo, all church organization, all sacred books, all hope in a personal survival, etc. The simple and direct fact of the feeling of the eternal, which can very well not be eternal, but simply without perceptible limits, and like oceanic as it were. Et comme océanique." This is really interesting. I think what he's doing is anticipating the contemporary distinction between being spiritual and being religious. There's this whole movement now called SBNR, right? Spiritual but not religious. And many people identify as SBNR. I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And Rolland, in his response to Freud's attack on religion in this book, Future of an Illusion, he seems to be saying the same thing. Freud, I agree with you that there are all sorts of problems with organized religion. But that's not the whole of religion, and it's not the most important part of religion. And it's not the spiritual basis of religion. What's the spiritual basis of religion? Well, spiritual experience, which he uses a really interesting word for. He says oceanic feeling. The French is sentiment océanique. Oceanic feeling. He's saying, Freud, you're straw-manning religion. Do you know what it means to straw-man something? What does straw-manning mean?
Like creating an argument that's not actually like the root of the issue, or like a false...
Yeah, it's not creating, but it's close, but it's not quite. See, when you're criticizing something or attacking something, if you're creating a straw man, you're attacking something that's not actually the real position. So in the same way, Freud demolishes what he calls religion, and Rolland's saying, but you're missing the essence of religion, which is spiritual experience. So that means you're not even, so you're creating a straw man, which means it's not like a real thing that you're attacking, and then knocking it down. Okay. Then it gets even more interesting. Rolland, who's sort of trying to convince this atheistic psychoanalyst, Freud, to accept the validity of spiritual experience and the importance and value of spiritual experience. What does he do? He sends to Freud hard copies of two books which he has just published, namely the biographies of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. 1929, he published the biography of Sri Ramakrishna. In 1930, he published the biography on Swami Vivekananda. He sends both of those books to Freud to read. And he says, read those books carefully, and you'll see these two great souls, these great saints, actually experience this oceanic feeling. And they were tremendously active in this world. So it's not that they were locked up in caves and ignoring humanity and weirdos in the way that Freud sometimes suggests. But they were very well adjusted in the world, and in fact devoted their whole life to serving humanity. one thing that's interesting, so as I said, this debate happens almost under the surface in a way, because they're not directly criticizing each other, but it's just beneath the surface, all the criticism on both sides. And both of these biographies, especially his biography of Swami Vivekananda, it's full of criticisms of psychoanalysis. If you read both the biographies from cover to cover, the one on Sri Ramakrishna and the one on Swami Vivekananda, you're going to find constant references to psychoanalysis in footnotes in the body of the text. Because it was all the rage at that time. Freud was very, very popular. It's a very new thing, and everybody's trying to use a psychoanalytic method to analyze all sorts of things. And doctoral dissertations were being published defending psychoanalytic interpretations of great mystics like Pseudo-Dionysius, psychoanalytic interpretations of mystical experiences. This was becoming very popular. Rolland was aware of all of these things. And so he was criticizing the psychoanalytic approach to mysticism and mystical experience and religion in these biographies. So when he's sending these books to Freud, it's not just a kind of friendly gift. He's sending him these pretty strong critiques of Freud's own baby. He's the founder of psychoanalysis, and there's very strong criticisms of psychoanalysis from a Vedantic standpoint in both of these biographies. And I'm going to talk about what some of those criticisms are. Freud claims to read these biographies. Of course, when people send me things, I don't necessarily read them from cover to cover. So I think Freud, I imagine he probably skimmed. And so he either skims or he reads parts of both of these biographies, but he remains unimpressed. And he sends a letter to Rolland on January 19th, 1930. And he also sends over his new book, Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, which is translated famously in English as Civilization and Its Discontents, which is a really poor translation of the title. The German title is The Uncanny in Culture, actually, Das Unbehagen. Anyway, that's a separate issue. This is his second book-length attack on religion, Freud's. And this time, because he's already had an epistolary exchange with Rolland for a couple of years now, he explicitly targets Rolland's Oceanic Feeling in this book, Civilization and Its Discontents, and criticizes it. And he says, yes, what Rolland calls the Oceanic Feeling, which he claims so many mystics have experienced and which is the true source of religion, all that's false. It's not really a mystical experience of any kind. It's not a spiritual experience. These mystics are deluding themselves when they think that they're making contact with some kind of higher truth, some kind of ultimate reality. All of that's bogus. What is it? This oceanic feeling is nothing but a regression to what Freud calls a pre-Oedipal feeling of unity with the external world. So some of you might know, but as an infant, after a certain number of months, the infant starts to distinguish subject from object and starts to see it as a self distinct from others. But prior to that period, the baby can't even recognize its distinction from the external world. It all kind of melts together. It doesn't have its own identity over against the world. So Freud is saying mystical experience is that. It's regressing back to the state of an infant from age 0 to, I don't know what it was, 6 months or 9 months, whatever it is, before that period when it starts to distinguish self from other. And then he argues that while Rolland claims that the true source of religion is spiritual experience, this oceanic feeling of oneness, spiritual oneness, Freud said that's all bogus. The true source of religion is a feeling of helplessness, a childlike, infantile feeling of helplessness, and the need that a child feels for a father's protection. So he's claiming that the need for religion, what seems to be this universal, cross-cultural need for religion, stems not from any kind of spiritual drive, any kind of real spiritual urge. It's a feeling of helplessness and a feeling that you need some kind of father figure to help you, protect you, and save you. Okay, so that in a nutshell is the debate. But I want to first analyze in more detail what exactly are Rolland's main criticisms of psychoanalysis in his biographies of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda? And what does he propose as an alternative to this psychoanalytic approach? Okay. Okay, so in his biography of Sri Ramakrishna, Rolland, he mentions Sri Ramakrishna's teaching that, quote, absolute continence, meaning sexual purity, must be practiced if God is to be realized. Now, psychoanalysts don't buy all that, and they say that there's no such thing as absolute continence, and people who try to practice celibacy end up repressing their sexual urges, and that creates all sorts of psychological complexes and neuroses that create problems for them. This is just a kind of fundamental axiom in psychoanalysis. And so psychoanalysts tend to interpret these mystics in this way, through this psychoanalytic lens, claiming that because they just believe that genuine celibacy, healthy celibacy is not possible, they say that that must result in certain psychological neuroses. And then they claim that these mystics' experiences are actually symptoms of neurosis. That's the idea. Rolland is aware of this kind of psychoanalytic approach, and he directly criticizes it. And he says that what these psychoanalysts overlook is that there's a crucial distinction between repression on the one hand and sublimation on the other. And that what mystics are doing is sublimating sexual energy into spiritual energy. The Sanskrit terms are, Swami Vivekananda talks about in Raj Yoga, which is a text that Rolland talks about in his book on Swamiji. Swamiji says, through spiritual practice, we try to convert retas into ojas. Retas is a sexual energy. We try to convert it into ojas, which is spiritual energy. So that same energy that's used to fulfill usually worldly aims can be transformed and used to make spiritual progress. So Rolland puts it as follows. He says, all great mystics and the majority of great idealists, the giants among the creators of the spirit, have clearly and instinctively realized what formidable power of concentrated soul, of accumulated creative energy, is generated by a renunciation of the organic and psychic expenditure of sexuality. So this criticism of psychoanalysis is actually very pertinent these days. Why? Because there are a few contemporary scholars who have written on Sri Ramakrishna from a psychoanalytic standpoint, like Jeffrey Kripal, the book that caused a lot of controversy called Kali's Child. But Narasimha Sil has also written a psychoanalytic interpretation of a whole book, giving a psychoanalytic reading of Sri Ramakrishna's life. Carl Olson, I think, is another one. And Rolland's criticisms still apply, even now. And we can find the same kinds of flaws in these contemporary psychoanalytic studies of these great mystics like Sri Ramakrishna, as we found in the text that he was reading back in the 1930s. You don't need to read the books because they're not particularly good, but it's good to keep these things in mind. How might you respond to people who are criticizing Sri Ramakrishna or other mystics from a psychoanalytic standpoint? What's wrong with that approach? So Rolland, in his second appendix to his book on Swami Vivekananda, makes three main criticisms of psychoanalysis. The first one is, he says that psychoanalysts have a kind of preconceived bias against mysticism. Why? Because they are temperamentally inclined against anything spiritual. Just temperamentally, they don't really have a spiritual bone in their body, and they're not open to spiritual possibilities or possibilities beyond the ego and beyond the ordinary rational mind. Here's how Rolland puts it. He says, the intuitive workings of the religious spirit have been insufficiently studied by modern psychological science in the West, and then too often by observers who are themselves lacking in every kind of religious inclination, and so are ill-equipped for the study, and involuntarily prone to depreciate an inner sense they do not themselves possess. And you might think, well, maybe that's not fair. Maybe some of these psychoanalysts are spiritual. But at least in the case of Freud, Rolland seems to have hit the mark. Because Freud himself admits in a letter to Rolland, this is from July 20th, 1929, Freud says, "To me, mysticism is just as closed a book as music." So he doesn't like music, he doesn't care for mysticism. And Rolland's kind of shocked by this, and he says, "I can hardly believe that mysticism and music are unknown to you, because nothing human is unknown to you." It's a quote from, I don't know, maybe that's an expression from text. And he says, "Rather, I think that you distrust them because you uphold the integrity of critical reason with which you control the instrument." So he's suggesting that Freud's kind of rational impulse is in overdrive, and that's preventing him from appreciating genres like art and spirituality, which require sort of more heart than head, or at least a combination of the two. Okay, so that's the first criticism. And in fact, he develops this criticism further in his biography. And he says that many of these psychoanalysts, they're abnormally extroverted. They're too focused on the external world. And they have this aversion to introversion, what he calls introversion, which is contemplation, inward contemplation, meditation, these kinds of spiritual practices that we all practice. And so he turns the tables on psychoanalysts by saying that that excessive extroversion is itself a neurosis. And so he ends up saying, "And this depreciation of the most indispensable operation of the active mind, namely the withdrawal into oneself, to dream, to imagine, to reason, is in danger of becoming a pathological aberration. The irreverent observer is tempted to say, 'Physician, heal thyself.'" Do you get the, I mean, he's really poking the psychoanalysts here, and he's saying, they're doctors, they're medical doctors, they're supposed to be helping their patients, but it's the physicians that need to be healed first. They themselves they need to sit themselves on the couch first and heal themselves, then they can help other people. Rolland's second criticism of psychoanalysis is that they tend to have a reductive understanding of mystical experience because of certain preconceived ideas rooted in their own psychoanalytic framework, okay, which they're sort of so wedded to that they can't think outside of that paradigm. So here's how he puts this criticism. He says, "You, doctors of the unconscious, instead of making yourselves citizens of this boundless empire," meaning the spiritual realm, "and possessing yourselves of it, do you ever enter it except as foreigners, imbued with the preconceived idea of the superiority of your own country, and incapable of ridding yourselves of the need, which itself deforms your vision, of reducing whatever you catch a glimpse of in this unknown world to the measure of the one already familiar to you?" It's a subtle, I mean, it's one long sentence actually, but it's quite profound actually. He's saying that the moment you enter a field that's foreign to you, which means foreign to psychoanalysis, for instance, the spiritual realm, whenever you encounter spiritual phenomena, what do? You're wearing your psychoanalytic glasses and you analyze them and explain them away from your psychoanalytic standpoint without letting them sort of speak for themselves and letting them be as they really are. What are some of these ideas, these preconceived ideas that these psychoanalysts are so wedded to? Well, one thing that's striking about many mystics is that they tend to worship God as mother. Sri Ramakrishna, of course, that's well known, but there are many other mystics who also have that same kind of feeling, that feeling of a child yearning for its divine mother. In even Christian mysticism, you'll find that. Mother Mary. And psychoanalysts have a field day with all these mother tropes in mystical literature, and they say, see, that shows that these mystics are regressing to an infantile state and calling on mother, mother, because they're helpless. Now, Rolland makes a really brilliant observation here. And what he says is, see if I can find the... Yeah. Okay, well, the actual language is too complicated. I'm just going to paraphrase. So what Rolland says is, what these psychoanalysts, the mistake that they're making is to mistake discursivity means rationality. Okay, so they're mistaking the pre-rational state of an infant with the post-rational state of the mystic. Because superficially they look similar. This reminds me of, because I've given some talks on the three gunas, and sattva on the surface looks very similar to tamas on the surface because neither of them is doing much of anything. But the sattvic person is deep in meditation and thinking of God, and the tamasic person is deep in deep sleep or doing drugs or something. So in the same way, what Rolland is saying is that psychoanalysts make the mistake of, there are these kind of three levels. Bottom level is the pre-rational level. Middle is the rational level. Above the rational is the trans-rational or post-rational. Or supra-rational is the best word to use, okay? Sub-rational, rational, and supra-rational. And Rolland says, mystics have attained this supra-rational state. Spiritual experience involves transcending reason and gaining direct experiential access to an ultimate reality beyond the reach of the ordinary mind. And what psychoanalysts do is mistake it systematically for sub-rational experience, the sub-rational experience of an infant prior to the Oedipal stage. Another preconceived idea that psychoanalysts have is the idea of infantile sexuality. This is if anyone knows anything about Freudian psychoanalysis, you'll have heard of the Oedipus complex, which means that from a very young age, the boy lusts for his mother. And Rolland has some pretty scathing things to say about this. He exchanges letters not just with Freud, but with another psychoanalyst, a Swiss psychoanalyst named Charles Baudouin. And he says to him, this is from a letter written in 1922, he says, "I'm speaking to you, my friend, in all affectionate candor. Nothing seems more false and revolting to me than this obsession, not in the child, but imputed to him, with sexual things." And then he says, in another letter to the same psychoanalyst, "Whatever the child says, writes, or draws, you," meaning you, the psychoanalyst, "are ready to reduce it to 3 or 4 motifs. Oedipus or Electra complex." What is the Electra complex? The daughter's lusting after her father. So it's just the obverse of the Oedipus complex. Okay. Oedipus or Electra complex, sexual themes, etc. But it is you, the psychoanalysts, who are obsessed with all this. So it's funny. And then the third criticism he makes of psychoanalysis is that they have an incomplete understanding of the mind, because they tend to just distinguish 3 layers of the mind. There's the unconscious, there's the conscious, and then there's the superego. This, at least within the framework of Freudian psychoanalysis. And what Rolland says is, if you penetrate beneath the unconscious, you reach what he calls this archaic level or layer of being. You reach a kind of metaphysical substratum, which he calls the ocean of being. That's what he claims mystics realize when they attain this state of the oceanic feeling. They go deep beneath even the unconscious to reach this kind of spiritual bedrock, where they realize the spiritual unity of all beings. And he says psychoanalysts don't acknowledge the reality of this deeper metaphysical spiritual substratum of our minds. So, after criticizing psychoanalysis, Rolland says, "I propose a much better and more comprehensive science." He calls it a new science of the mind, but it's not one that's invented by him. He says you can find this in what Swami Vivekananda calls Raj Yoga and Gana Yoga, especially Raj Yoga, but he combines the two. Raj Yoga is a text that we've just started reading in our... So we'll be reading that for the next few months. It's based primarily on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the philosophy of yoga. And the main spiritual practice taught there is what's called Ashtanga Yoga, the 8-limbed yoga. And Rolland explains the 8 limbs of Patanjali's yoga in some detail in his biography of Swami Vivekananda. And he says that what's the goal of all this? So yama is ethical practices. Don't steal anything, practice celibacy, purity, this and that, many other things, non-injury. And niyama are different spiritual practices. And then as you go up the scale, finally it should culminate in spiritual realization. So Rolland says, if you study this text carefully, you're going to find that it's very scientifically worked out. And it's not just making dogmatic assertions. It's saying, if you do X, Y, and Z, the following result will come about. So first do the X, Y, and Z, and then you can judge whether or not it's a legitimate claim. Take it as a hypothesis. Follow the instructions given by Patanjali and Swami Vivekananda. If you fail, or if it doesn't work, then you can say something about it. The other thing that the other point he makes, which I think is really important and interesting in the context of Raj Yoga, he says, if you study Patanjali's Yoga Sutra carefully, you're going to find that Patanjali was profoundly aware of the power of the unconscious mind. How important the unconscious mind and how it plays a kind of surreptitious role in our day-to-day lives without us knowing it. How in many cases the unconscious is what actually drives us without us knowing it or thinking about it. So in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, there's a Sanskrit term called samskara, which are latent mental tendencies. Those are stored in the unconscious. And it's those samskaras that make us do either good things or bad things. If we have a lot of spiritual samskaras, it's going to make us feel sort of spontaneously drawn toward meditation and other spiritual practices. If we have a lot of worldly samskaras, it's going to make us feel temperamentally and naturally and spontaneously drawn toward engaging in worldly things, without us really even knowing that we're really the puppets of these samskaras that we've acquired through our previous births, what we've done in previous lives. We're born with these sets of samskaras, which we ourselves have cultivated through our own actions in previous lives, through our own behavior in previous lives. So that's the framework that he's thinking of here. And then in that context, Rolland says, the ancient yogis, he's thinking of Patanjali and more recently Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, he greatly admired Sri Aurobindo. Rolland says, the ancient yogis did not wait for Dr. Freud to teach them that the best cure for the mind is to make it look its deeply hidden monsters straight in the face. It's a beautiful phrasing here. This unconscious is full of all sorts of terrible stuff. And it didn't take Freud to come along in the 20th century for us to realize that. These yogis understood this many centuries ago, millennia ago. And the other thing, which is really important, is in psychoanalysis, the patient is putting his or her hands in, or their fate in the hands of a psychoanalyst, which is another human being, and that person is usually quite flawed in his or her own right, but you're kind of handing over your agency to another person. And Rolland says, a much better method is one where you don't have to surrender your agency to anyone or anything, where the mind is, you can turn the mind on itself and analyze your own samskaras. You can be your own psychoanalyst. That's the beauty. You can psychoanalyze yourself if you're a mature spiritual aspirant. So he says the following: it has actually been proved by Raj Yoga that sovereign control of the inner life is able to put into our hands, partially if not entirely, our unconscious or subconscious life. So Patanjali teaches us how to become aware of our unconscious tendencies, and even more importantly, how to transform them, how to spiritualize those samskaras that are lodged in our unconscious, that are hindering our spiritual progress. And we don't need somebody else to help us with that. Of course, that sometimes the guru is absolutely necessary. But that guru plays a different role. He's not like a medical doctor who's diagnosing our pathological conditions. He's a spiritual guide. But the best guru, Sri Ramakrishna would often say, he says, your own mind at a certain point becomes your guru. And ultimately, Satchitananda is a guru. what about Gana Yoga? Swami Vivekananda wrote a separate book called Gana Yoga, and Rolland also gives a summary of that. And Rolland doesn't spend a lot of time on this, but what he says is in Gana Yoga, because of this emphasis on Advaita, on oneness, he says, it's in Jnana Yoga that Swami Vivekananda elaborates the spiritual ideal, which is this realization of our fundamental oneness, the spiritual unity of all beings, which he calls the Oceanic Feeling. And so Patanjali gives us a kind of scientific method for arriving at this spiritual realization of spiritual oneness, of transcendental oneness with everyone and all beings. Okay, so I just wanted to conclude with this observation, which is that, well, okay, so how did this debate end up? You might be wondering. Not well. Rolland, so Freud kind of takes personally some of the digs that Rolland makes in his biographies and gets defensive about them, but doesn't really answer them adequately. So in my article, I actually make a case that Rolland wins the debate. Not coincidentally, you'll see. I'm biased, but no, I actually do a kind of analysis of Freud's responses one by one to Rolland's criticisms, and I find them wanting in various ways. But you can decide for yourself. If you want, you can look at the article for the actual arguments. I don't want to go into, it'll take me too far afield. We don't have the time. And Rolland digs in his heels, and he says, just because you don't accept mystical experience doesn't mean that I have to buy into the psychoanalytic debunking. I'm going to stick to my ground. And they kind of, they remained friends, but became their relationship cooled a little bit. And I wanted to mention one more thing, which is that Rolland's criticisms of psychoanalysis from a Vedantic standpoint were prescient in many ways, because he anticipated more recent critiques, especially some of you, I bet, have heard of the contemporary spiritual thinker Ken Wilber. Some of you must have. No? Ken Wilber? Okay, yeah. So he's got this concept which has become popular called the pre-trans fallacy, Ken Wilber. He says, this is how he defines it. Ken Wilber says, the essence of the pre/trans, so pre/trans. The essence of the pre-trans fallacy is itself fairly simple. Since both pre-rational and trans-rational states are in their own ways non-rational, they appear similar or even identical to the untutored eye. So he's thinking of these contemporary psychoanalysts who are mistaking the super-rational states of mystics for the pre-rational states of infants, which is exactly the criticism Rolland made many, many decades ago of psychoanalytic approaches to mysticism, right? And I also wanted to mention that a number of Rolland's criticisms dovetail really well with Sri Aurobindo's really interesting and penetrating criticisms of psychoanalysis. Because remember, Sri Aurobindo was born in 1872, left his body in 1950. So he also lived, he was a contemporary of Rolland's. Rolland read Sri Aurobindo's work and was extremely impressed with it and mentions it in his biographies of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And some of Sri Aurobindo's disciples asked Sri Aurobindo about Freud and psychoanalysis. Says, hey, what do you think about this new science, which is all the rage? And Sri Aurobindo says some really interesting things about psychoanalysis. I want to share with you some of the things that he says. So in one letter, he says the following. Sri Aurobindo says, the psychoanalysis of Freud is the last thing that one should associate with yoga. It takes up a certain part, the darkest, the most perilous, the unhealthiest part of the nature, the lower vital subconscious layer, isolates some of its most morbid phenomena, and attributes to it and them an action out of all proportion to its true role in the nature. Modern psychology is an infant science, at once rash, fumbling, and crude. As in all infant sciences, the universal habit of the human mind to take a partial or local truth, generalize it unduly, and try to explain a whole field of nature in its narrow terms, runs riot here. Moreover, the exaggeration of the importance of suppressed sexual complexes is a dangerous falsehood, and it can have a nasty influence and tend to make the mind and vital more and not less fundamentally impure than before. So you can see the resonances with Rolland's criticisms, I hope. One of the things Sri Aurobindo is saying is that Freud is focusing too strongly and too obsessively on just the unconscious, and not the unconscious as a whole, but taking the most sordid aspects of the unconscious and then generalizing them and saying that everybody is kind of slaves to the darkest aspects of the unconscious. And there's really no escape from it. Freud's main aim in psychoanalysis is, this is the famous slogan in German, wo es war, da ich sein soll. Where the id was, id means the unconscious. There the I shall be, the I in the sense of ego. So through psychoanalysis, you bring somebody who's suffering from various neuroses. Why are they suffering from these neuroses? Because they're slaves to the unconscious. The unconscious is sort of affecting adversely their behavior in certain ways, which are unbeknownst to them. So what's the cure? The psychoanalytic cure is to make them healthy egos. But of course, that's not the ultimate goal, according to anybody who believes in spirituality. We have to even transcend the ego, right? After you develop a healthy ego, you have to ultimately transcend the ego. So that's what Sri Aurobindo is talking about. And in another letter, he says the following: I find it difficult to take these psychoanalysts at all seriously when they try to scrutinize spiritual experience by the flicker of their torchlights. They look from down up and explain the higher lights by the lower obscurities. But the foundation of these things is above and not below. The superconscient, not the subconscient, is the true foundation of things. Now listen to this. This is a very poetic and beautiful expression. He says, the significance of the lotus is not to be found by analyzing the secrets of the mud from which it grows here. Its secret is to be found in the heavenly archetype of the lotus that blooms forever in the light above. It's a beautiful sentence. So here too, see, using this metaphor of the lotus, what is he saying? The problem with psychoanalysis is that it's tracing everything back to sort of its sordid roots, which is the mud in the case of the lotus, right? But the best way to judge the lotus is to think of the heavenly archetype of that lotus in the divine realm above. That's the idea. So this is really just echoing Swami Vivekananda's idea that in essence, we are all divine, actually. It's the opposite of the Christian doctrine of original sin. We're not most fundamentally sinners. We're most fundamentally divine. And our current state is a groping after. It's a kind of struggling toward that state of divine perfection, which is our deepest essence. So we should judge ourselves by what's highest in us, not by what's lowest. And we can see our current state, which is kind of intermediate state, right, as working toward this highest state of spiritual perfection. Okay, I think I'll end there because I want to open it up to questions. I'm sure you have some, and even if you don't, maybe some people online will. So any questions about anything I said? Or that Rolland or Freud said?
Not so much questions, but a statement. It seems like Freud is giving most importance to...
Can you wait for the mic so that people online can hear you?
It seems like Freud is giving... It seems like Freud is giving the most importance of emotional maturity to the actual physical body, which is we would actually put at the lower end, within the mud. In fact, most of his theories when he was examining women is the idea of the histrionics, when so many mystics seem to suggest that women actually are more tantric than much of the rest of humanity, that was the most, how did you describe it, sub-rational of states. The emotional maturity for him would be the controlled physicality that exists within a mature body.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, I think that's right. I think one of the dogmas of psychoanalysis is that we are nothing but our bodies. There's no spiritual entity separate from the body-mind complex. So that's the opposite of Vedanta, right? Yes. Thanks for making that point. Yeah, and he would tend to diagnose women as suffering from hysteria and subject to certain emotional fits and these kinds of things. Yeah. Anyone else? Didn't you have a question?
I'm working on it.
You're working on the question. Anyone else before we look online? Do you have your hand up or no? No. Okay. Let's see if I can find this. Okay. Oh, can you read it? Is it readable?
Here's the first one.
Okay.
Freud is unanimously discredited by almost all of modern psychology, but I notice Vedanta monks keep on quoting him. Why this obsession with a discredited scholar?
Well, I think that it's a sweeping generalization to say that he's discredited. That's part of the problem, is that it really depends on the field. And look at humanities, where Freud is still very, very popular. He's in vogue. And books still come out using Freudian psychoanalysis as a lens for interpreting not just mystics, but great historical figures in the past and many things. And so the questioner might think that Freud has been discredited, but not everybody agrees. Any other online questions?
Some different statements.
Oh, but another part of, I guess another way of answering the question, it seems to be implied in the question that there are more sophisticated and less crude forms of psychoanalysis that are more popular maybe or current these days. And I think that's probably true. Even Jung, who was a disciple of Freud, who then kind of broke away and Freud got angry with him, and they parted ways, and Freud was much more spiritually inclined. And there are psychoanalysts working today who are they identify more with the Jungian form of psychoanalysis than the Freudian one. And actually, if you're interested in this, for this questioner, there's a book written by William Parsons called The Enigma of the Oceanic Feeling. The whole book is a discussion of this debate between Romain and Sigmund Freud about mystical experiences. And what Parsons claims is that what Rolland's doing is anticipating these more these post-Freudian kinds of psychoanalysis, which are more open to spiritual possibilities. But in my own article, I argue that Rolland's criticism of psychoanalysis is even more radical than that. Because he's saying that we need to replace the psychoanalytic framework altogether with a deeper spiritual framework grounded in Vedanta. That's what I think Rolland's doing. Yeah. Any other questions?
I wonder what Lacan would have to say about such divine mystical experiences and what Vedantic critique of Lacanian psychoanalysis would be like.
Yeah, I wonder too. I don't know. I'd have to, the question is referring to Jacques Lacan, and that would require a different class, I guess, and I have to, he's famously obscure as a writer. But I think he would be more open to spiritual experiences. But it would take a different class, and to answer that well.
Can you comment on Carl Jung from Vedanta monk perspective?
Jung actually, I think he even visited Belumat, I believe, and I think he visited our archives or asked to consult our archives. So he was aware of, I think, Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda to a certain extent. He wrote books from a spiritual standpoint. One was called Man in Search of the Soul, for instance. There are a few things that, look, I'm not an expert in Jung, but there are a few things like he famously distinguishes between introversion and extroversion. And so he does. And when Rolland uses the terms introversion and extroversion, he's thinking of Jung's use of the terms. And Jung uses the term introversion to accommodate things like spiritual practices like meditation and turning inward. So Jung is fundamentally more spiritual and more open to spiritual possibilities as a psychoanalyst than than Freud. Jung is also famous for his idea of the collective unconscious, the idea that it's not just individual unconscious like Freud claims, but that there's such a thing as a group unconscious. The unconscious of an entire nation, for instance. Yeah, anything else? Lisa's got another question, unless there's something online. Okay, why don't we ask Lisa first? Let the online people regroup.
Didn't Jung, in his last book, the Red Book, try to examine his own personal experiences that in relation to spiritual exploits that he actually
That's interesting.
had?
I haven't read the Red Book, so I don't know. So his last book is called the Red Book?
I think and it almost is less of a philosophical polemic than it is an examination of his own internal
spiritual experiences.
Yes.
Wow,
Yeah.
cool. I'd have to read that. Thank you.
My question is sort of coming.
Is it yours or you're reading from online?
No, I
Okay,
actually
it is
had
your
a personal question.
You're looking at the
that
screen and it's
that's
confusing.
because I'm noticing that my personal question is sort of coming out in some of
Oh, I
these
see.
online
Okay.
questions, which one person was saying that both Freud's position is lacking, for too deep in psychology, and even Rolland's position is lacking because ones like Vashishta or Buddha have the correct breadth of perspective to dive into the full scope of consciousness. And earlier I was thinking to ask something, as both points seem to be very clear and credible from their own perspective of subtlety or grossness. From
Okay, hold on. Let's pause for a second. 'Cause let's not mix up the online questioner's question and yours.
Then, well, my
so
question.
let's focus on the online one first, because you just read it, right? Isn't that the one you just read out?
No, I'm summarizing someone who gave
Oh.
several comments.
Oh, I see. You weren't reading straight from.
No.
Oh, okay. Oh, then okay. Let's treat your question separately then. Okay. Yeah.
So my question is it simply a matter of the subtlety of the measurement tool still providing an accurate result for that tool, essentially moving from lower truth to higher truth, that none of the, or any of the perspectives actually incorrect, or from the psychoanalytic perspective where Freud himself, his own subtlety of mind, only has the capacity to measure things in this way, he's providing an accurate representation of that. Rolland, from the subtlety of his mind, providing an accurate representation of that, and yet even more than that, someone like a Vivekananda, a Ramakrishna, from their subtlety of mind, or Patanjali being able to give a fully comprehensive measurement down beneath the depths and above the heights.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. I would just say that we have to be careful about not becoming too relativistic about things and saying that, like Freud's right in his way and Rolland's right in his own way and Ramakrishna's right in his own way. That's not what you're saying, is it?
I mean,
Well, put the mic closer to your mouth so people can hear you.
Yes, I think that is what I'm saying.
Yeah, so I think that's problematic.
But that it requires the view of being able to identify the measurement tool, saying, yes, you're correct because you measured that with a yardstick.
I know, but that,
yes, you're correct because you measured that with
is it tomato or tomato? Or is the glass half full or half empty? Because if you're using a tool that's fundamentally falsifying the phenomenon, like if you're wearing glasses that prevent you from seeing what the thing actually is in truth, is that a correct observation or is that a distorted observation? Do you see what I mean? And so what Rolland is saying is that when Freud puts on his psychoanalytic glasses to examine mystical phenomena, he necessarily falsifies the phenomena and he reduces them to his own measure. Does that make sense?
When we put on our academic glasses, are we falsifying spirituality?
One could. It just depends on, there's no such thing as the academic approach. There are many different kinds of academic approaches to spirituality. Some are more reductive than others. Jeffrey Kripal's book is an academic approach to mysticism, but it's a psychoanalytic one. But there are many other kinds.
There's a few more online questions now. Can you comment on Vashishta's inquiring method?
Vasishta. His method of inquiry. I don't know. That's a whole other can of worms. It's like because it involves this giant text called Yoga Vasishta.
that's the same person who was saying neither opinion is correct. It requires a higher mind like Vasishta.
I see, like Vasishta's. Yeah, so the thing is, look, I mean, who are we to judge Rolland? That's one thing to keep in mind. Rolland actually claimed, he said in his letters to Freud, that he himself has experienced the Oceanic Feeling. And if Indians are biased against non-Indians, and that's, that's a certain kind of ethnic discrimination, I would say. Yeah, who are we to judge what his spiritual attainments really were? That's part of what I'd say. But secondly, yeah, regarding Vasishtha, that text is a very interesting kind of philosophical hybrid of Advaita Vedanta in the mold of Gaudapada, that this world is a dream, that the only truth is non-dual pure consciousness, and also there are influences of Kashmiri Shaivism in there as well. And so the kind of inquiry that Vasishtha is engaging in that text is an Advaitic kind of who am I sort of inquiry. Yeah. Other questions?
According to a study by Gross, of all academic fields, psychology has the most, 61%, non-believers. Why? To what extent is it Freud's influence versus something else?
61% of psychologists are non-believers, and that's the highest in any field. I find that extremely implausible, because in the fields I'm working in, philosophers are probably 90% atheist or agnostic. So 61% sounds pretty low. I don't know I'd have to look at the figures in the study that you're referring to. But modern academia is overwhelmingly I want to say either atheistic or agnostic. If you ask a typical academic, whether they're scientists or whether they're humanities scholars, they're either atheists or agnostics, with a few exceptions. That's what I've found in my experience in academia. And part of the reason is because academics tend to be highly intellectual, and those who are highly intellectual tend to sort of short shrift or overlook or suppress the heart to a certain extent, which is, I think, necessary to open yourself to possibilities beyond the rational mind. Blaise Pascal is an interesting case because he was a great French scientist who had an extraordinary mystical experience, which was so powerful that he etched into his lapel, into the inside of his blazer, the exact date of his mystical experience and what happened. And he became a Christian convert, even though he was very skeptical before. And he wrote this beautiful book called Pensées, which means thoughts in French. And he says these wonderful things. One of them is one of my favorites, is the heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. The heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. And I think that academics would do well to open themselves to their hearts. Yeah.
One more here.
Is it that everything depends on from which point of view we see the things? If we keep it in body, we end up with Sigmund views, and if beyond ego, end up with something like Vedanta?
Yeah. Yeah, that seems like a nice way of putting it. I mean, there are these, in Taittiriya Upanishad, there's a scheme of the 5 levels of being: Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya. And each of these is a real level of being. They're not unreal, they're real. But if we identify with a particular level, we're going to see everything through that framework, basically. And so if we think of ourselves as bodies, we're going to see everyone else's bodies. If we think of ourselves as minds, then we're going to think of everything see everything through an intellectual lens. But if we identify with our deeper divine nature, the Anandamaya Atma, then everything becomes divine. So I think I would agree, depending on, what the question really means. Sorry?
Gita 17 chapter also, Sri Krishna still arrogant to their mind, the Sattvic, Rajasic, Manasic, they eat food.
Yeah, many different things. Yeah, so Vedanta also distinguishes different kinds of activities and behavior based on the 3 gunas: sattva, rajas, and tamas.
Is Carl Jung collective unconscious same as attaining unity?
No, I don't think so. But again, I mean, I'd have to read this red book that Lisa's talking about. I don't know what, and maybe it's. I mean, I think that scholars say that Jung's own psychoanalytic thinking evolved in the course of his career, and that maybe after he was exposed to Vedantic ideas and other spiritual ideas, his understanding of psychoanalysis and possibly even his concept of the collective unconscious might have evolved. I'm not a Jung specialist, so I can't say anything for sure about these things.
I'm quite clearly a slave of samskaras. Freud indicated I cannot do anything about such things. What help does Vedanta offer?
Patanjali tells us, and Vedanta tells us, that no matter how bad our samskaras are, how worldly they are, by changing our current behavior, we can actually overhaul our samskaras. So let's start right now. And even if it's very difficult, if most of our samskaras are pulling us in one direction, we have that strength in us, because each one of us is divine, and we have the strength of the divine within us to move in the opposite direction and to fight with those worldly samskaras. And how do we do that? By cultivating new good samskaras, spiritual samskaras, through spiritual practice, through ethical living, through self-control, self-discipline, purity, truthfulness, and all the practices taught in Vedantic scriptures. All right. Any more in-person questions? Or we're going to end right on the nose, 8:30, or it's really 8:31. All right, thank you very much. Fun class. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.